Miles Davis, one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. Kind of blue, bitches brew, in a silent way, etc., etc. And then in 1985, you're under arrest. Synthesizers, Simmons drums, Cyndi Lauper, Michael Jackson, Sting shouting the Miranda warning in French. What happened? An album that is almost a textbook example of a product of its time. An album that did not age well. So the question remains, is it really that bad? Over the past few weeks, we've gone pretty deep into the world of Miles Davis. We ranked his studio albums and counted down his best songs. But along the way, there was one album that stuck with us for a very different reason. You're Under Arrest. An album often regarded as one of the weaker moments of his career. Too slick, too 80s, too many synthesizers, drum machines, and too much pop music. Check out our album ranking to see where this album eventually ended up. But is that reputation actually deserved? Today, we're going back to 1985, to the story behind the album, the songs, the production, the sequencing, and of course, that cover. And we'll look at the album You're Under Arrest might have been. Let's find out, is it really that bad? In 1981, Miles Davis returned after nearly 6 years of silence with the man with the horn. But Miles hadn't come back to look nostalgically at his own past. As so often throughout his career, he wanted to know what was happening right now. Funk, R&B, synthesizers, drum machines, a new generation of musicians. After We Want Miles, Star People, and Decoy, it was clear that the Miles Davis of the 80s was a very different musician from the man who had made Kind of Blue. And that was exactly the point. Miles was approaching 60, but musically, he refused to behave like an old man. The old musicians stay where they are and become like museum pieces under glass. In early 1984, he went back into the studio. The band around him included young musicians such as bassist Darryl Jones, guitarist John Scofield, and keyboardist Robert Irving III. During the sessions, an old familiar face returned as well, John McLaughlin, appearing on a Miles studio album for the first time since On the Corner. The recording sessions would eventually last almost a year, from January 1984 to January 1985, and meanwhile, Miles was looking increasingly beyond jazz, towards pop music. Not because he suddenly wanted to become a pop star, but because Miles believed that a good song was a good song, whether it was written by George Gershwin or Cyndi Lauper. And that is exactly where the story of You're Under Arrest begins. By late 1984, the album that would eventually become You're Under Arrest was beginning to take shape. And that title wasn't just a gimmick. Miles regularly had problems with the police in California. In his autobiography, he describes how officers would hassle him when he drove around in his yellow Ferrari. According to Miles, they didn't like seeing a black man driving a $60,000 car. But for Miles, You're Under Arrest was about more than just the police, about literally being locked up, about being politically imprisoned, about pollution, and above all, about the constant threat of nuclear war. It sounds pretty heavy. And then the album begins. One phone call/street scenes. A nervous bass, sirens, car noises, voices, synthesizers, percussion. Everything happens at once. And my first thought is actually pretty simple. Am I listening to the opening track by the great jazz legend Miles Davis? Or a failed radio play? Underneath all the chaos is a funk groove that's actually pretty decent on its own. But the track doesn't seem to go anywhere. Mostly more and more just gets added. More sounds, more voices, more layers. And Miles himself? His trumpet sometimes gets almost buried in his own production. Given the subject matter, the voices were probably meant to be completely serious. But almost 40 years later, some of them sound more ridiculous than threatening. We hear Spanish, Polish, and eventually, French, or rather, Sting. And honestly, the story behind those few seconds of Sting is a lot more entertaining than the track they ended up on. Bassist Darryl Jones was working with Sting at the time. After his time with Miles, Jones had ended up in Sting's new band, the Blue Turtles. And because Sting was a huge admirer of Miles, Darryl asked if he could bring him along to the studio one day. Miles was fine with it. Sting finally got to meet one of his great childhood heroes. It wasn't quite the meeting he had hoped for. Miles looked at him. "Sting, huh?" "Yes, sir." Miles slowly repeated his name, as if he wanted to taste it first, and then told Sting that he had the biggest head in the whole world. The entire studio started laughing, except Sting. Miles then did what Sting thought was probably an attempt to make things right again. Sting? Do you speak French?" By Sting's own account, his French was rudimentary, so he said, "Yes." Miles handed him the words an arrested person in America's told. "Translate this." "How long have I got?" 5 minutes. Sting went into a blind panic. He ran to reception and called home in London. His wife Trudy spoke excellent French, except Trudy wasn't home. She was having dinner at an Indian restaurant in Westbourne Grove. So Sting had to get through to the restaurant, have Trudy brought to the phone, while Miles's assistant was already standing in the doorway again, asking whether he was ready. Eventually, Trudy came on the line. Sting had no time to explain. "Please don't ask any questions. Can you translate this into French?" And then he read it to her. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Sting's autobiography, Broken Music, doesn't tell us what Trudy was thinking at that moment. But just imagine the situation. You're sitting quietly in a restaurant when your husband suddenly calls you from America, the former singer of the Police. He tells you not to ask any questions, and then starts reading out the Miranda warning. Had Sting been arrested by the police? No. He was in the studio with Miles Davis. Trudy finished the translation, and moments later, Sting ran back into the studio with his piece of paper. Miles took him to the microphone and gave him one simple instruction. As soon as Miles gave him the signal, Sting had to shout that French text at him as loudly as possible.
Tu as le droit de tenir le silence. Rien que nous dis va se faire contre toi. Alors, tais-toi.
And so, moments later, Sting found himself standing beside one of his great childhood heroes. Not long afterwards, Sting was back outside, bewildered, but also incredibly happy. He was on a Miles Davis record. And the track he'd had to make a frantic call to London just to be able to contribute to? One phone call. A fantastic story. Unfortunately, it still doesn't make One Phone Call/Street Scenes a fantastic track for me. Now that I know what Miles is trying to convey, I understand the chaos better. But context gives meaning to what you hear. It doesn't give it a melody. For 4.5 minutes, the funk groove stays in place while more and more sounds are piled on top of it. So do I understand One Phone Call/Street Scenes better now? Absolutely. Do I like it any better because of that? Not really. Fortunately, after 4.5 minutes, Miles himself seems ready for a little peace and quiet as well. Because then, almost everything falls away. Human Nature, Michael Jackson. And suddenly, You're Under Arrest sounds like a completely different album. After all the voices, sirens, synthesizers, and nervous energy of One Phone Call, You're Under Arrest suddenly seems to come to a standstill. And above all, a moment of recognition. Michael Jackson had released Human Nature 2 years earlier on Thriller, where, for me, it is one of the album's many highlights. But take away Michael Jackson's voice, the lyrics, and all those distinctive vocal mannerisms, and what are you actually left with? An incredibly strong melody. And it turns out to be almost made for Miles's trumpet. He plays remarkably sparingly, leaves silences, holds notes, and above all, gives the melody room to breathe. And suddenly, we hear Miles again. Even the unmistakably 80s production, which we're going to struggle with quite a bit elsewhere on this album, doesn't get in the way here at all. Perhaps because human nature itself is a product of the 80s, the synthesizers and electronic sounds don't feel as if they've been layered over an older composition. They're part of the song's DNA, and that makes the contrast with the opening track almost impossible to overstate. There, Miles was almost buried beneath everything that was happening. Here, he gets a melody and space. Apparently, that's all he needs. You're Under Arrest got off to a pretty false start, but for now, the album has recovered. And Miles himself was apparently far from finished with human nature. The song would remain part of his live repertoire for years. But why Miles Davis recorded a Michael Jackson song in the first place? We'll come back to that later. Next comes a title that almost requires a gatefold sleeve. MD1/Something's on Your Mind/MD2. We begin with something that almost sounds like a train rushing past. Pumping bass, synthesizers, electronic drums, and a small melodic motif that at least gives you something to hold on to. But after the open space of human nature, we're almost immediately thrown back into the extremely synthetic side of You're Under Arrest. In fact, the first few minutes sometimes sound as if someone accidentally put on the background music from an 80s commercial. You can almost hear the voiceover. The rap-tastic, tasty rap, tasty-tastic! And interestingly enough, you can already hear something of the electronic world Miles would venture much further into a year later with Tutu. Those pumping synth chords in particular remind me of Perfect Way. Not the same composition, but definitely from the same sonic family. Fortunately, something eventually appears that does give the track a character of its own. John Scofield. His guitar sounds dustier, more human, almost old-school fusion against all that slick electronics. And for a moment, things get interesting, but there's something else rather strange about this track. The title tells us we're listening to 3 different sections. MD1, Something's on Your Mind. MD2. The middle section is a recent song by Hubert Eaves III and James D. Train Williams, which Miles had already played live before this recording. But while you're listening, try to pinpoint exactly where MD1 ends. Something's on Your Mind begins, and then MD2 takes over again. I can barely hear it. And as the track goes on, what initially seems like movement starts to feel more and more like a loop. The same electronic pulse, the same sonic landscape. Scofield trying to breathe some life into it, but hardly any development. So after 7 minutes and 16 seconds, I arrive at a rather painful conclusion. There hasn't been a single moment when this music truly came alive for me. And yet, another pattern is becoming visible by now. Michael Jackson, and now D-Train. In 1985, Miles Davis is clearly looking for songs outside the traditional jazz world. Why he's doing that will become much more important later on. Then the groove changes again. Ms. Morrisine. After the pumping electronic drive of MD1/Something's on Your Mind/MD2, the tempo drops back a little. The rhythm gets more room to breathe. No pop cover this time, but a composition by Miles Davis, Robert Irving III, and Morrisine Tynes Irving. And immediately, something positive stands out. The bass line is strong, the arrangement feels better balanced, and after the excess of the previous tracks, Miss Morrisine actually sounds a little less bombastic. But then there are those drums, and this is exactly why I sometimes hate the sound of the 80s so much. The rhythm itself is fine. The drum sound isn't. Fortunately, a more interesting sound world starts to develop around it. Bass guitar, marimba-like textures and synthesizers that almost sound like pan flutes create a pretty solid foundation. The atmosphere even reminds me a little of Dire Straits' Ride Across the River, coincidentally from the very same year. Only some of the synthesizers here are considerably more shrill. And then an old acquaintance appears, John McLaughlin. The guitarist who played such an important role on In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew, a tribute to Jack Johnson and On the Corner. For the first time since On the Corner, we hear him again on a Miles Davis studio album, but don't expect a nostalgic reunion. This is 1985. Synthesizers, electronic drums, a pumping bass line, and cutting straight through all of it. That guitar. Interestingly enough, once again, it's the guitarist who gives the track the most character for me. Miles himself makes much less of an impression. His trumpet never really provides that one moment that lifts Ms. Morrisine above its arrangement. It all moves along quite pleasantly. Not chaotic, not terrible, but not especially memorable either, until McLaughlin finally gets a little more room. His solo starts to take off. And for the first time, I think, yes, I wouldn't mind hearing this go on for a while. And right then, fade out. Okay, not a disaster, but a highlight? Not really. Fortunately, McLaughlin isn't finished yet, because after Ms. Morrisine, we get just 40 seconds to prepare ourselves for the longest track on the album, Katia. Ms. Morrisine slowly disappears in a fade-out, and almost immediately, fade in. Katia Prelude. For 40 seconds, it sounds roughly as if someone has put Ms. Morrisine back on, only at 45 revolutions per minute instead of 33 1/3. Hyperactive synthesizers. Nervous, dissonant guitar. It's full of energy, just not the kind of energy that gives me a particularly large dose of endorphins. And after 40 seconds, it's already over. Then Katia begins, with another fade-in. During my first listen, I literally wrote down, why does that prelude even exist? But this is where the original LP turns out to be able to do something the CD can't. Katia Prelude closed side A. Then you had to turn the record over. And Katia opened side B. Ah, so I couldn't have known that. I've never bought this album, and so far, I don't particularly feel like I've missed out. Anyway, new side of the record, new opportunities. Katia. John McLaughlin is here again, but where his guitar gave the music character on Ms. Morrisine, his playing works much less well for me here. Restless, dissonant. The bass, on the other hand, is strong again. And the additional percussion at least gives the electronic production something organic. But then there are those synthesizers again. Sharp, busy. And meanwhile, I start wondering about something else. Where is Miles? It takes almost 2 minutes before his trumpet really makes its presence felt in the track, but when he appears, surprisingly little changes for me. It still sounds like an 80s backing track that Miles just happens to be soloing over. And as Katia continues, I keep waiting for some development. A hook, a memorable melody, chemistry between the musicians. Something. Instead, more and more sounds and ideas keep appearing. Flute-like sounds, percussion, synthesizers. An arpeggio even reminds me for a moment of On the Air by Peter Gabriel. And with that, a rather unfortunate pattern begins to emerge during this listening session. The elements I do like, remarkably often remind me of better songs by someone else. And Katia just keeps going, 7 minutes and 37 seconds. But for anyone who reaches the end and thinks, gee, I wonder what this would sound like if Miles had added almost another 3 minutes, I have good news. In 2022, the complete studio session of Katia was also released on the Bootleg Series Volume 7, 10 minutes and 24 seconds.
When does the hurting stop?
But ultimately, the length isn't even my biggest problem with Katia. The track barely moves. It piles ideas, sounds, and musicians on top of one another. But for me, the chemistry that would make it all come together never appears. A missed opportunity. And if there is a good track hidden somewhere deep inside, then this version is about 6.5 minutes too long. After more than 8 minutes of Katia and Katia Prelude combined, You're Under Arrest could really use a melody again by now. Fortunately, there's one waiting for us, time after time. And then relief. Time after time. After all the nervous synthesizers, harsh drums, and sound collages, we finally get something You're Under Arrest has had surprisingly little of so far: a beautiful melody. Cyndi Lauper released Time After Time in 1984. And for me, the original is already magical. That melody, those lyrics, Lauper's voice, and perhaps above all, the restraint with which she sings it. Yes, Cyndi Lauper. Restrained. But apparently, Miles hears the same thing in the song. He recorded his version as early as January 1984 and does what he would later do with Human Nature. The voice disappears. The lyrics disappear. And what remains is that melody. Only the production certainly doesn't sound any less 80s than the original. In fact, Miles somehow manages to make Time After Time sound even more 80s than Cyndi Lauper. But you know what? Here, it doesn't matter at all, because Miles makes the song completely his own. He plays with restraint, no excessive notes. He lets his trumpet speak, and suddenly we hear exactly why Miles Davis could say so much with so few notes. The melody tells the story. That's all he needs. For me, Time After Time is without question the second genuinely great track on You're Under Arrest. And Miles himself was apparently far from finished with it. He kept playing time after time, year after year, or rather, time after time, until almost the end of his life. And something remarkable happened along the way. A pop song from 1984 became a Miles Davis standard. Maybe that was exactly the idea from the beginning, but we'll come back to that later. For now, Human Nature and Time After Time have at least proved one thing. The 80s don't have to be the problem on You're Under Arrest at all. We have about 10 minutes left. 2 tracks. Can You're Under Arrest still save itself? We begin with the title track. "6 minutes and 12 seconds. Written by John Scofield. And from the very first seconds, I feel like I'm being chased again. A hyperactive guitar, nervous synthesizers, percussion, a heavy bass line. The first guitar solo sounds angular and dissonant. Everything moves, everything pushes. And after the calm of Time After Time, I really have just one request. Could this arrest maybe proceed a little more peacefully? Apparently not. Maybe somebody's resisting. Because once again, I find myself wondering, where is Miles? According to my stopwatch, it takes roughly 1 minute and 20 seconds before his trumpet really makes itself heard. Maybe he was late for his own recording session again. Jack Johnson. Sessions? Anyone? No, of course, we don't actually know that. But when Miles finally does come in, surprisingly little changes. The band just keeps charging ahead, and he seems to be trying to find a place for himself inside an arrangement that already feels completely full without him. Then Bob Berg appears on tenor saxophone, and it's actually his short solo that briefly gives the track a different character. Scofield's second guitar solo works better for me than the first one as well. But meanwhile, I'm still waiting for something that is becoming a recurring problem on this album. A hook, a chorus, a melody. Something to hold on to. It never comes. No police officers this time, no voices, no sirens, no sting. So despite the title, we don't get a Second Street scenes. Just 6 minutes of nervous 80s funk relentlessly pumping away. Strong rhythm section, guitar, saxophone, synthesizers. There's plenty happening. But once again, I'm missing the most important thing. A reason to remember the track. Hang in there. We're almost at the end of the album. There's just one more track to go. Jean-Pierre / You're Under Arrest / Then There Were None. And then, the finale. A moment to catch our breath. Darryl Jones delivers another strong bass line. And now that we're almost at the end of the album, we might as well declare him my man of the match. Because whatever else happens on You're Under Arrest, those bass lines are consistently good throughout the entire album. Meanwhile, we begin on more or less familiar ground. Miles had been playing Jean-Pierre live for years. Except at first, it sounds as if nobody is entirely sure whether we've actually started yet. Is Miles still warming up? Are we still tuning? Slowly, fragments of the familiar Jean-Pierre melody begin to emerge. But the title tells us that these are three separate sections. Jean-Pierre, you're under arrest. Then there were none. Just try to pinpoint where one ends and the next begins while you're listening. I can't. What I can hear is the music gradually becoming stranger and stranger. Jumpy, almost indefinable sounds. Spooky. For a moment, it even reminds me of the waiting room from Genesis' The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Another pretty tough track to get through. But fair is fair. This is musically interesting. Siren-like sounds, a crying baby, an almost music box-like passage that sounds beautiful and deeply ominous at the same time. Everything becomes increasingly threatening. And suddenly, it becomes clear why Miles wasn't only talking about police and arrests at the beginning of this album story, because according to Miles himself, this final section is about nuclear destruction. The synthesizers are meant to represent a nuclear explosion. Afterwards, Miles's trumpet is heard almost entirely on its own. He described it himself as the crying of a baby, or perhaps one of the last survivors. Then we hear bells, for the dead, and a voice begins to count down. The apocalypse is near, the end of the world, or at least the end of the LP. Thank God. Goodbye, cruel world. But this time, the sound collage works better for me than it did at the beginning of the album. All those strange sounds actually seem to be leading somewhere. Not to a hook, not to a chorus, but to the end of the world. A pretty apocalyptic ending for an album that began with Sting shouting at Miles in French. But apparently, even at the end of the world, Miles Davis can't resist getting in one last joke. After the explosion, we hear his voice, almost unintelligible.
Ron, I meant for you to push the other button.
Ron, I meant for you to push the other button. And with that, You're Under Arrest comes to an end. Not with a grand finale, but with Miles Davis having just blown up the world. Because apparently someone pushed the wrong button. 9 tracks, 43 minutes, police violence, pop music, funk, love, nuclear destruction, and Sting. There's a lot on You're Under Arrest. The only question is whether there's actually one album on it. Because maybe the problem isn't just the individual songs. Maybe it's in the way this album sounds, the way it's put together, and even the way it looks. Sound, sequence, sleeve. The triple S factor.
It's a thing.
It's not a thing. We've heard the songs, but an album is more than just the sum of its songs. So when we ranked all of Miles Davis's studio albums, we also judged 3 other things: sound, sequence, sleeve, the triple S factor.
Patent pending.
And back then, I was actually pretty generous. You're Under Arrest got 6 for sound, 7 for sequencing, and even 7 for that cover. Apparently, we were feeling generous. So it's time for a second opinion. Let's start with the most obvious problem. You're Under Arrest. Sounds incredibly 80s. Synthesizers, electronic drums, Simmons drums, drum machines, digital textures, effects. But saying this album sounds bad simply because it sounds so unmistakably 80s is far too easy. Because human nature sounds 80s, time after time perhaps even more so, and both sound perfectly fine. So the problem isn't the decade. The problem is what they do with those tools. On one phone call, the production is so packed with voices, sirens, and effects that Miles almost disappears at times. MD1/ Something's on Your Mind / MD2 comes dangerously close to library music for me. And on Katia, the synthesizers become downright exhausting. Again and again, the arrangements get fuller: bass guitar, drums, percussion, synthesizers, guitar, another sound, another layer, and somewhere in between all of that, Miles Davis. That is my biggest problem with the sound of this album. Not that Miles wanted to sound modern. He absolutely should have. The problem is that the production sometimes almost reduces him to a guest soloist on his own album. So, no, I'm not deducting points because You're Under Arrest sounds like 1985. I'm deducting points because, to my ears, a large part of You're Under Arrest simply doesn't sound very good. Original score, 6. Second opinion, 4.5. Then there's the sequencing, and here, we have to give Miles credit for one thing first. While streaming the album, I genuinely couldn't understand why Katia Prelude exists as a separate track. 40 seconds of chaos, fade out. And then Katia simply starts again with a fade in. Until you look at the original LP. Katia Prelude closes side A, you turn the record over, and Katia opens side B. That makes more sense, but it still feels fairly pointless. It's still more of the same. On CD, all that disappeared was the moment of turning the record over that separated the two tracks on vinyl. So, on that charge, case dismissed. But that still doesn't save the sequencing, because look at what happens to the two best tracks. Human Nature is track 2, sitting between One Phone Call and the more than 7-minute MD1 medley. Time After Time sits on side B between Katia and the title track. They're almost like two moments of calm on an album that keeps returning to the same nervous electronic energy. That contrast may be deliberate. In fact, sometimes it even works. After One Phone Call, Human Nature feels like a relief. After Katia, Time After Time feels almost like medical assistance. But for me, good sequencing ultimately has to do more than provide occasional relief. It has to make an album move, create an arc, make us feel as though we're going somewhere. And that's what I'm missing here. The album begins chaotically, calms down, gets nervous again, slows down, explodes again, calms down again, and then keeps pumping away until the world literally ends at the end of the album. There are some interesting contrasts, but hardly any flow. My original score, 7. After this re-listen, that feels too high. But because of that original LP structure, and because some of those contrasts absolutely do work, I'm not going to punish it completely either. Second opinion, 6. And then, the cover. I once gave this a 7. I have no idea what was wrong with me that day. Miles Davis, one of the most stylish musicians of the 20th century. The man behind Kinda Blue, In a Silent Way. Bitches Brew, On the Corner. And in 1985, we get this. A photo of Miles in what looks like a very serious attempt to personally wear every single item of clothing from the 80s at the same time. Those clothes, those colors, that typography. And then that title, You're Under Arrest. Subtle it is not. But I also want to be fair here, because just like the production, this cover isn't so aggressively 80s by accident. Miles was fashion. He wanted to be contemporary. He didn't want to appear on the cover as some venerable old jazz legend looking back on his glory days. This is Miles Davis in 1985. Modern, provocative, bold, and completely convinced of his own style. As a time capsule, fantastic. As an album cover I actually enjoy looking at, no. And maybe that makes it the perfect visual equivalent of the music on You're Under Arrest. I understand exactly what it's trying to be. I even admire the conviction with which it does it. I just don't have to think it's beautiful. Original score, 7. Second opinion, 5. So our original Triple S, sound 6, sequence 7, sleeve 7, becomes, after the second opinion, sound 4.5, sequence 6, sleeve 5. That's not a minor adjustment. That's a serious downgrade. But this is where the story gets really interesting. Because while Miles was working on the album that would eventually become You're Under Arrest, there was another possibility, an album built around exactly what works best here. Modern songs, strong melodies, new standards, an album that ultimately never appeared. New Ballads. The album we've just heard, wasn't originally the album Miles Davis intended to make at all. In early 1984, Miles had a different idea, an album of contemporary ballads, or, as the project was called, New Ballads. And the basic idea was actually perfectly logical. Why should a jazz standard, by definition, have to be old? Miles had played standards throughout his entire career. My Funny Valentine, Stella by Starlight, On Green Dolphin Street, songs that had once simply been popular music. So why, in 1984, should you only look backwards? Why couldn't Michael Jackson, Cyndi Lauper, or Tina Turner provide the standards for a new generation? Miles began looking at recent pop music from the same basic principle: find the melody, and then strip away what you don't need. That suddenly explains the two songs that worked by far the best during our listening session: Human Nature, Time After Time. Not random commercial excursions on You're Under Arrest, but remnants of a different album concept. And originally, the plan was even more ambitious. Miles wanted Gil Evans to write the arrangement, the man with whom, decades earlier, he had made Miles Ahead, Porgy and Bess, and Sketches of Spain, among others. Robert Irving III was involved in those preparations, and later recalled that several conversations with Gil took place. But Evans had his own projects, and ultimately the collaboration never got off the ground. So Miles kept looking. Dozens of recent songs were considered and transcribed. DeBarge, Dionne Warwick, Kenny Loggins, Nick Kershaw, Roberta Flack, Chaka Khan, Tina Turner, Michael Jackson, Cyndi Lauper. Not all of those songs were actually recorded. That distinction is important. So we can't simply reconstruct a lost Miles Davis album and say, this was the track list. We don't know that track list. But with one discarded pop cover, we now know exactly what happened. Tina Turner, What's Love Got to Do with It? Miles recorded the song on December 26, 1984. And it didn't make You're Under Arrest. Miles later said about the recording, "We recorded Tina Turner's What's Love Got to Do with It, but I scratched that." And for almost 40 years, all we could do was speculate about what it sounded like. Until 2022. That's when the recording was finally officially released on the Bootleg Series Volume 7. That's what happened. 1982 to 1985. And suddenly, we can hear a glimpse of the album that might have been Human Nature, Time After Time. What's Love Got to Do with It? 3 contemporary pop songs, 3 strong melodies, and suddenly, New Ballads becomes much more than an interesting footnote, because there's something else. Robert Irving III later described You're Under Arrest as essentially 3 different albums that were ultimately merged together. The ballads, the funk pieces, and material that grew out of live performances. And suddenly, our criticism of the sequencing starts to make a lot more sense. Maybe You're Under Arrest felt, while we were listening, as though several different albums were fighting each other. Because in a way, they were. Miles changed his mind. According to sources, he eventually felt the original material leaned too heavily on ballads and decided to change the concept. The final album was quickly reshaped into the much more erratic record we know today. And that brings us to an irresistible question. So, what if? What if Miles hadn't abandoned that original idea? What if Human Nature and Time After Time hadn't been the exceptions, but the starting point? What if What's Love Got to Do with It had simply stayed on the album? What if Gil Evans had had the time? What would that album have sounded like? What would it have looked like? We'll never know exactly, but we can imagine it. Miles Davis, New Ballads, featuring contemporary standards by Cyndi Lauper, Michael Jackson, Tina Turner. This album never existed. This cover never existed. And this is very deliberately our reconstruction of what could have been. But the idea behind it, that really was Miles's. And maybe that is ultimately the most frustrating thing about You're Under Arrest. We don't have to fantasize about a completely different direction. Part of it is already on the album. We've heard it twice. And both times it worked. So maybe the question is no longer what could have been, Maybe the question is, did Miles make the wrong album? And with that, we finally return to the question we started with. So, You're Under Arrest, an album with a reputation. Too slick, too commercial, too many synthesizers, too many drum machines, too much pop music, too 80s. And after this entire journey, we can finally answer the question, is it really that bad? Yes, but not for the reasons I expected. Because first, let's dismiss one charge. Pop music is absolutely not the problem. In fact, the two best tracks on this album are the two most obvious pop covers, Human Nature, Time After Time. So no, Michael Jackson and Cyndi Lauper didn't ruin You're Under Arrest. They saved it. And as far as I'm concerned, the 80s themselves are acquitted as well. A production doesn't automatically age badly just because you can hear what year it came from. The problem begins when that production becomes more important than the music it's supposed to support. And that happens far too often here. Miles gets buried beneath the arrangements, tracks keep pumping away without going anywhere. Something is constantly happening, but remarkably little of it sticks with you. And yet, this isn't a worthless album. Darryl Jones is fantastic. Scofield and McLaughlin have some strong moments. And the apocalyptic ending becomes much more interesting once you understand what Miles was trying to depict. But there's an important distinction here as well. Context can explain why a choice was made. It can make that choice more interesting, but it can't force me to like it. And then there's New Ballads. Perhaps the most frustrating piece of evidence of all, because Miles had already found the direction that works best for me, treating contemporary songs as new standards. But we shouldn't romanticize New Ballads either, because there's always a danger lurking in a concept like that. Take familiar pop songs. Remove the vocals, put a slick contemporary production underneath them, and have an instrumentalist play the melody. On paper, you're suddenly not all that far removed from Kenny G. And that's a fine line, because playing a pop song on trumpet doesn't automatically turn it into a new jazz standard. It only works when Miles adds something to that melody that nobody else could have added. And that happens on Human Nature. It happens on Time After Time. His timing, his silences, his phrasing. Miles uses the melody as material and makes it his own. That's the difference between a pop cover and Muzak. So would New Ballads automatically have been a better album? No. Maybe it would have been great. Maybe not. We'll never know. And we're certainly not going to pretend that we, in 2026, know better which album Miles Davis should have made in 1985, but we can judge the album he actually released. And that 6.7 from our Miles Davis album ranking, that was generous. Very generous. For me, You're Under Arrest isn't a failed album because Miles embraced pop music, not because he used synthesizers and electronic drums, and certainly not because he refused to make Kind of Blue all over again. That last point is actually one of the things I admire most about him. Miles kept moving, kept searching, kept taking risks. And if you do that throughout an entire career, sometimes it goes wrong. For me, You're Under Arrest is one of those moments. Not because Miles moved forward, but because this time, the music didn't always move with him. So, is it really that bad? Yes, but at least now, we know why. And that was Miles Davis. That was You're Under Arrest. So, what do you think of this album? Is it really that bad? Or can you actually appreciate it for what it is? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to vote in the poll. You can listen to the music featured in this series through our Spotify playlist and follow our social media pages for all the latest updates, because I will follow you if you follow me. This video is the third episode in our Miles Davis artist arc. If you're curious to see where You're Under Arrest ended up in the complete Miles Davis album ranking, click the card. Thanks for watching. See you next time. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.